today I'm joined by Professor David Kertzer, who teaches at Brown University, and he teaches in many different specialties. So I will turn it over to him and let him explain who he is because he does so many different things that rather than me goofing it up, I will let him tell us who he is. So thank you, Professor Kertzer, for joining us. It's an honor for me to speak to you. I've read so many of your books, so please tell our viewers about yourself.
Well, my PhD is actually in social anthropology, and my initial interest was primarily politics and religion. And back many years ago, when I was about to do my dissertation, in the early 70s, I became fascinated by Italy because it had both of course, the home of the Catholic Church, but also the largest communist party at the time outside of the communist world. So, how those two could coexist became uh, the question that I tried to pursue for my dissertation. So I spent a year in what was then considered the capital of communist Italy, Bologna, living in a working class neighborhood and examining the attempts by the church and the Communist Party to compete for the allegiance of the local working class population. That led to my dissertation and then my first book called Comrades and Christians, Politics and Religion in Communist Italy. But I'd also always had an interest in history. And so I began in kind of rainy days spending in the basements of churches where they had so-called status animarum, which was mandated back in the 16th century in the church that each year the parish priest would take a census of his parishioners. And so I was able to follow the transformation of peasant Italy into urban modern Italy or industrial Italy by looking at the hundreds of years of these registers. And so I became interested in historical demography, and some of my writings were on that topic. But quite a few years ago now, over 25 years ago, I made kind of a decision, career decision, that if I was going to write more books, I like to reach a broader audience, not just fellow academics and students. And I found Italian history, 19th and 20th century Italian history, fascinating. And there were very few authors writing for a broader audience based on original archival work in 19th, 20th century Italian history. So, with a book called The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara, which had to do with a Jewish child who was forcibly taken on orders of the Inquisitor in 1858 in Bologna, which was then part of the Papal States, on the grounds he had been secretly baptized by the Jewish family's illiterate Christian servant girl. I wrote a book based on this original archival work, but written in a style that I thought would interest a larger readership. And that book, called The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara, really was the beginning of several books I've now written over those last 2.5 decades of this sort, dealing with both 19th and 20th century, primarily state politics, political relations with the church. In Italy, of course, when you talk about politics and religion, you're talking about the Vatican, the Catholic Church, and the Italian state.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned the kidnapping of Edgardo Mortora, say no, Mortora,
Mortara.
uh, Mortora. Yeah, that was It's one of your books is on my list. I haven't read it yet because I was focusing on your other books on like the Italian Papal States and up through World War II. It's on my list, so I know a little bit about it. So I was actually going to ask you to mention that one and tell people about that. So thank you for that. So so you've done anthropology and politics and Italian studies and history. So is there one label or one term that you like to apply to yourself? You say, I'm an anthropologist, I'm an Italian studies expert, I'm a historian, or you're all of these things.
I guess you could say all those things. I've never been one to believe in the barriers between disciplines. I mean, for example, as an anthropologist, if you're interested in the relationship of politics and religion, why would you confine yourself to ethnography or to archaeology? Why wouldn't you use historical materials to better
Right.
elucidate the relationship of politics and religion? So I don't necessarily think of myself as going from one discipline to another. At Brown University, I was in both the anthropology department and the history department, along with the Italian studies department. So, um, one of the good things about being an academic is you can, at least after you have tenure, kind of range freely and where your intellectual interests lead you, not be confined by disciplinary boundaries.
Yeah. And you mentioned like the intersection of politics and religion and history. If you notice my logo in the upper corner, that's what I focus on. Like I focus on the social, the political, and the religious, and how all of these. It's almost like to me, it appears as a continuum. Like the social feeds the political feeds the religious, and so on, and that makes history. So that I guess maybe that's why I love your book so much because I relate to that political history of religion and how it all ties together. So, and you mentioned the archival research, and that to me is what really made me fall in love with your books. The depth of the archival research just blew me away. Especially what I really loved the most was the diplomatic correspondence that you copy. Like, the I can't remember all the names. I've got them all written somewhere, but like, the French ambassador or the American ambassador, and like it was unbelievably like how candid these diplomats were with what they were seeing in the papal states, and like you would think diplomatic correspondence would be like kept a secret, but I guess it's like like after 75 years, these kind of things are released. So like how do you get access to that, or do you have a team of researchers that help you find these sources?
Well, for the most part, in my career, I've worked by myself. Um, in recent years, I've had a colleague, an Italian colleague, who works with me in the primarily in Roman archives and Vatican archives, which has been very helpful to me since although I spent many years living in Italy, I'm not there all the time, and most of my archival work is based in Italy. But I've also spent time in France, working in various French archives, where I've for my most recent book on World War II and the papacy, I needed to work also in German archives in Berlin, the archives of the German ambassador to the Holy See. And because I don't read German, I did there have to depend on a young researcher whom I hired, a recent PhD from Germany, who spent a year working in those archives, identifying documents of interest to me and getting them copied, so I digitized. So I ended up with about 1,300 pages of that correspondence that was particularly juicy from my point of view in telling the story of World War II and the Vatican's relation with the Nazi state. And then I had luckily a German graduate student help me translate the materials that I needed. Um, but I've enjoyed working in archives in different countries, especially Italy, Vatican archives, and Italian archives, but also the French. The French diplomatic archives are actually divided between uh, just outside Paris now and Nantes in the west. So if one wants to work in those archives, you actually have to go between two different cities just for the diplomatic archives. But there's nothing like finding a document that's really sheds new light on the history you're interested in and kind of holding in your hands. Or in 19th century, of course, 19th century documents are handwritten, and to hold a document like I remember once in a Vatican archive coming across a letter handwritten by Metternich to the Pope at the time. And to look at this in a letter that no one had looked at in 100 years or more, written by someone like Metternich, is can be really a thrill.
Yeah. So is there one document that stands out to you that really impacted you that you didn't like this was something you really surprised you? And like is there any one that really stands out?
Well, probably just because it's most recent. The Vatican just opened the archives for World War II during the papacy of Pius XII in 2020, and I was there the first day they were opened,
Oh,
and I ended up with several thousand pages digitized from that archive, part of the basis of my recent book, The Pope at War. And when we came across a series of documents in the Secretary of State of the Vatican Archive, which were transcripts of secret negotiations the Pope engaged in with the German ambassador, or German, I should say, Hitler's personal envoy to the
yeah,
Pope, something that had been kept secret for 80 years by the Vatican.
yeah.
This is
I recall.
really
I
quite
remember that.
striking.
Yeah, yeah. I
But
was I was surprised by that. Yeah,
well, I think everybody was. And in fact, when I found these documents, it was shortly after they opened the archives. So in the summer of 2020, which, by the way, as you may recall, was the middle of COVID, which provided a further complication for access.
yeah,
But I got in touch with my editor at Random House and said, gee, I just found this incredible series of documents. I mean, not just that these negotiations took place, which had been kept secret, but that the Pope had kept a transcript. There were, by the way, the conversations were in German. The Pope was fluent in German, Pius XII.
Well, he'd been the nuncio to Germany prior
That's right.
to World War
He had
II.
spent a dozen years from 1917 to 29 in Germany as papal nuncio there. So he was good in languages anyway. So he had become fully fluent in German and held these conversations in German. And he um, kind of strangely kept apparently one of his German Jesuit assistants in a adjoining room because I don't think that Hitler's envoy knew these were being recorded. And he was this, I think, German Jesuit wrote down the transcript of their conversations, and this is what I found. So I told my editor, I really can't wait for my book to come out because someone else is going to come across this. It's just so explosive. And I've been writing a series of articles for the Atlantic on related topics, and I knew they'd be interested. And my editor said, "No, absolutely not. You can't. You've got to save this for the book." And just hope that no one gets to it first.
Beat you
And
to it.
I spent about a year at that point almost a year before the book came out, kind of nervously waiting to see if someone else had revealed these documents, but no one did. So
Yeah.
I
Well,
guess I
it's
was
time
fortunate.
consuming. I mean, it's time consuming as an author myself. I mean, I know how long it takes to research, to document your notes, to then write it up and edit it. So, I mean, you did it in a record time to if it opened in 2020, the book came out 2022, right?
That's right,
Or
in
yeah,
spring
so
of 2022.
that was pretty fast.
Well, in
So,
that case, that book, there had been pressure on the Vatican for actually over 50 years to open the archives for World War II because of all the controversy about the so-called silence of the Pope during the Holocaust. And I kind of made a bet that, although the Vatican resisted opening them, and that the new Pope, Pope Francis, would be the one to open them because it's up to the current Pope to authorize the opening of the next papal archive that hasn't been opened. And so I began working in the archives that were open. And in fact, if you're going to write a history of the relation of the Vatican to World War II, it's not enough to work just in Vatican archives because the diplomatic archives, for one thing, are absolutely crucial of various of the countries that had envoys in the Vatican during World War II and who were sending almost daily reports of their conversations with the people around the Pope and occasionally with the Pope himself back to their governments in Vichy or Paris or London, Berlin, Rome. So I had already had tens of thousands of pages of archival documents that I'd identified in those other archives uh, already digitized and working through them when they opened the archives in February or in March rather 2020. So that was kind of the last part of the research I needed to do.
yeah. So what's it like? Like, how hard is it to get access to the Vatican archives? Like, you would think they're not going to let just anybody in. There's got to be someone of your stature to let them to give them access. And
Well, they don't. So you need to apply. I mean, for one thing, there are different archives of the Vatican, and you might say the Vatican world because there are Vatican archives in Vatican City, but also the various congregations that make up the Curia. There's parts of the central administration of the church often have their own archives, which might be elsewhere in Rome. Um, but then not just that, but there are other archives like the Central Jesuit Archives are quite important for my research. They're not literally part of the Vatican, and they're not literally in Vatican City, although they're a stone's throw from Vatican City. But each one has a separate administration. But if we just take those in Vatican City itself that are most important for my work, the largest one used to be called the Vatican Secret Archive, but the Pope Francis, apparently thinking the name was sounded a bit sinister, a
a
few
little
years
bit.
ago renamed it. So it's no longer the Vatican Secret Archive, it's the Vatican Apostolic Archive. But each of these archives in the Vatican, another one that I use in Vatican City is the Archive of the Secretariat of State. And then the third, which is essentially in Vatican City, although not technically, but you enter it through Vatican City, is the archive of what used to be the Holy Office of the Inquisition, which has also been renamed and no longer called Inquisition, but the archive is in the old building of the Inquisition. Each one you need to apply separately to the administration for permission to use it. And then you, even after you have that permission, you need to apply for days you could work there. Some of the archives, like the Inquisition archive, only has places for about 6 researchers per day. So that can be another problem. Just even if you have approval to use the archive, to actually be able to schedule time there.
Right. That's interesting. I didn't realize there were multiple archives because like you would just think there would be one sort of central library that houses all of their stuff. But I guess for one for safety, because if there's ever a fire or some disaster, you'd lose everything. So I guess it makes sense to just
Yeah, I
distribute
mean,
them.
they're just under different administrations, so
Yeah.
they they've been kept. I mean, the Inquisition archive has been kept separate for hundreds of years. But then not everyone can apply or at least be accepted for access. They don't allow journalists in, for example. They don't allow undergraduate students in. But if you're a doctoral student working on a dissertation on a related topic, you could apply, for example. So you don't have to be a senior scholar to get access.
So why don't they let journalists in?
I don't know. I've actually had issues with this because New York Times, CBS News, others have asked to film me in working in the archives as part of stories they were doing, and in each case, we got absolutely nowhere, despite places like the New York Times and so forth trying to use their influence. Um, but I'm sure if you had the right kind of relationship with um, a journalist or a film crew or something, if they thought you were doing something that they wanted done, perhaps they would let you do it. But if they don't have control of it, they're not eager to have outsiders come in and bring attention to things they don't necessarily want attention brought to.
Well, that actually brings me back to a point when you said like Francis opened the archives. So is there some trepidation, at least on the, I would think, assume on the part of some of the people of the Vatican, that there's some wariness and trepidation of opening these archives because they know, there's all this embarrassing stuff in there. And like, especially, you said like, so what's it like working with these people? I mean, can some of them be, kind of obstacles to you, or some of them they go out of their way to really help you, or like, it sounds it's such a contradiction, like these archives that they're opening the archives because you would think they would not want to air their dirty laundry like this.
Yeah, in fact, one thing one learns, you talk about the Vatican or the church, but in fact, it's a very heterogeneous group of people. And so there are some, I mean, if we take, one of the archives I've been trying to have full access to, but have never been successful, is the archive of um, essentially the Archbishop of, not the Archbishop, but the bishop, the Vicariate, Cardinal Vicariate of Rome. And that archive is separate from Vatican City, but it's the central church archive for Rome and the church in Rome. So if you're interested, for example, in the German occupation of Rome for the 9 months from 43, 44, it would be quite important. And but they have not opened, when they opened all these other archives in 2020 for World War II, they didn't open the archive of the Cardinal Vicar of Rome, which is at St. John of Lateran Church. So that's a problem. The In the main Vatican archives, the a number of the archivists, I think, are very serious about wanting to look in clear-eyed fashion at this history, and not particularly happy with some of the cover-up that's happened to parts of this history by the church. Um, and they are getting out, in some cases, some important work themselves based on these newly available archival materials. Others are more, for various reasons, linked to the official narrative of the church and the apologetics, and are not necessarily happy with historians like me, who are trying to
Shine a light.
shine a light that doesn't go along with the official narrative.
Yeah. Well, that's a good segue to the one of your books, The Popes Against the Jews, was that book just blew me away. Like how how could the Vatican have issued their document we remember, which 1998, if I remember correctly, right? We
I
remember
think so,
conversion.
yeah.
So for our viewers, so in 1998, the Vatican released a document called We Remember, which was basically a justification for the anti-Semitism. And then Professor Kertzer wrote a book called The Popes Against the Jews, which I highly recommend you read. And I just it just blew me away. Like how can they, with a straight face, get away with saying, "Oh, we had nothing to do with anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism"? Okay, yeah, but anti-Semitism, that was nationalism, 19th century nationalism. Like it's just staggering. I just could not believe, like, just the self-delusion in that document in the We Remember, that you just laid it bare in your book.
Yeah. Well, yes, I mean it was John Paul II who, given all the controversy over the Holocaust and whether the church bore any responsibility for the anti-Semitism, the demonization of Jews that could have made the Holocaust possible. He called on there's a uh, organization at the center of the church on religious relations with the Congregation for Religious Relations with Jews. So he called on the cardinal who headed that to have his commission look at this question, and they spent 11 years and came out with a report. I've subsequently heard that the first draft got turned down because it wasn't sufficiently apologetic, and it took a certain amount of rewrites. But the document that came out with a preface written by the Pope himself, John Paul II, so it couldn't have been more authoritative, which was called "We Remember," on the Church and the Holocaust. And it stated, yes, unfortunately, some sons and daughters of the church were had negative views of the Jews based on religious ideas. Um, does not say anything about former popes or church councils, but sons and daughters of the church. But this had absolutely nothing to do with the demonization of Jews that led to the Holocaust, because that was based on so-called modern anti-Semitism, which, according to this document, had to do with not with religious, but with social, economic, political, racial negative views of Jews. But as I showed in that book, this bears absolutely no relation to actual history, in which the church, right from the beginning of modern anti-Semitism, which we generally date to the latter 2 decades of the 19th century, was very much involved in promulgating negative economic, political, social views of the Jews, and to some extent racial views as well. So this, unfortunately, from my point of view, and from many in the church itself, because this isn't something that just pits Catholics against Jews, but many in the Catholic world um, themselves realize that this statement cannot bear historical scrutiny, and the church needs to face the facts that the church was very much involved institutionally in demonizing Jews. And from my point of view, who was it who murdered all those Jews in the Holocaust? They weren't people who thought they were pagans. They overwhelmingly were people who thought of themselves as good Christians, or Christians anyway. And much of what they learned about Jews or knew about Jews, they learned from their parish priests or pastors, and not just, of course, Catholics, but also Protestants.
Yeah, yeah. I pulled up a quote here from that. As the virulence of anti-Semitism increased in Central Europe in the 1920s and 30s, met by papal silence, Catholics looking for guidance could find no better source than Civiltà Cattolica and L'Osservatore Romano. So if I mispronounce those, but that's a quote from the Popes Against the Jews, and it's like the Vatican just does not want to face up to its history. Like I think that the We Remember Council, like if you look at uh, the Galileo apology, if you look at the baptism, these are all like decade-long commissions that they come up with these rationalizations of why none of it's their fault. Do you have that same sense?
Yeah, well, one thing that particularly irked me, I must say, when that book came out, the response to We Remember, the book, The Popes Against the Jews, it prompted a very long, like 20-page review in Civiltà Cattolica. So Civiltà Cattolica, which is cited is the publication by a group of Jesuits, the head of which is appointed by the Pope, and its pages are have to be approved before publication by the Vatican Secretary of State. And that review by the member of the board, the editorial group that writes Civiltà Cattolica, responsible for history, um, kind of savagely attacked my book. And to me, the kind of amazing thing is one doesn't need to actually do archival research. If you go to any good Catholic library that has the old issues of Civiltà Cattolica beginning in the 1880s, they're filled with the most virulent anti-Semitic material that
Yep.
by no means are related only to religious ideas, but accuse Jews of not being loyal to the countries they live in, of wanting to rule over Christians and to reduce them to their slaves, and on, responsible for the sins of communism and capitalism. And so, for that journal to attack the findings of my book, which in part are citing their own materials, is really kind of sad.
Yeah. Like all you have to do is like look, look at the archives of their own newspapers. Like it's right there in black and white. Like it just boggles the imagination that they think, it's almost like I actually said once a couple of years ago, I said, I think Trump took a playbook from the Vatican. Just, bullshit your way through it, tell the lie and just tell it over and over and over again until people believe it. That seems to be a play of the Catholic Church that, just tell a lie and just tell it long enough and eventually people will believe it. So that's
Yeah, I
just,
would just say about the Catholic Church that I think there are differences within the church. It's true that this is the official position of the Vatican. Um, for example, the German church hierarchy, I think in 2020, came out with a statement, and I think before that, the French hierarchy had done something similar. But the German hierarchy said we've got to face the facts and recognize this is about World War II, that first of all, the church hierarchy called on all good Catholics to do their patriotic duty and go to war at Hitler's side, at Hitler's command. And secondly, the church, as the Holocaust was taking place, never came out and said this was evil and called on Catholics not to participate in it. So this is something neither the Vatican has done nor the Italian church hierarchy, because of course when Mussolini declared war at Hitler's side on Britain and France in 1940, the entire Italian church hierarchy and church organizations of the laity called on all good Italians to do their patriotic duty and go to war at Hitler's side. And then, in fact, a little bit later, the following year, when the Axis turned against the Soviet Union, they often referred to this as actually a holy crusade to do battle against the Allied powers. So this is something neither the Vatican nor the Italian church hierarchy has come to terms with so far.
yeah. Yeah, I documented that. I actually have that section up. I did a quick search. It says, additionally, in 2020, the German bishops issued a statement in observance of the 75th anniversary of the war's end, which recognized for the first time their responsibility and complicity with the Nazis. And this is a quote from their document. It took a long time before the church's own entanglements in the Third Reich and in the Second War were discussed and regarded in a self-critical manner in the Catholic Church in Germany and also among the bishops. Today, we look back in sorrow and shame to the victims and to those existential questions did not receive an adequate response from faith in light of the crimes of and of war. As the years have passed, the fact that for quite some time no regard was had for the suffering and the sacrifices of the others, not to mention any open statements, is particularly shameful. And this comes from the German Bishops' Conference. And then I follow that up with a statement from you. It says Kertzer writes that the bishop's admission acknowledges and contradicts the version of events given by Pius XII as, quote, misleading, and points out that neither the Italian bishops nor the Vatican have similarly demonstrated any such responsibility for the church failings during the war. So yeah, I
Yeah,
was quite
so
surprised
it
that the
means
German
that
bishops did
there,
that.
in that sense, there's some hope that eventually, but it's only going to be kind of screaming and kicking because in Italy, for example, now there's just almost every week there's a new apologetics comes out about the great heroism of the Vatican, of the Church, and of the especially of the Pope Pius XII during World War II and during the Holocaust. So there's a very strong reaction against facing this history with kind of clear-eyed view.
Yeah. I don't know, it's an interesting history for sure. So you mentioned, so when I first reached out to you about coming on the podcast, you were just in Italy in June, correct? You were
Yes,
there, so you were researching in the archives again?
yes, and I was there all last fall. I'll be there again all this coming fall. So I go back and forth,
Okay.
working in the archives, and right now I'm working on a new book. So um, that's related to this, but has to do with the racial laws that got it, so-called racial laws, which are the anti-Semitic laws in Italy. It got
Yeah,
introduced in
1937.
38,
Yeah,
in the fall of
38.
38,
Okay.
and were in force in some ways up until 1945 in the parts of Italy still under Mussolini's control.
Yeah,
And so part of it has to do with the relation of the church. They're called racial laws, but from my point of view, they could easily be called religious laws because it's not like they did some sort of genetic testing or, as in
yeah,
Germany, where they measured people's noses and things. In Italy, it was just a matter of whether you were Catholic or Jewish, and whether your grandparents were Catholic or Jewish. Um, and whether you married a Jew or married a Catholic. So this is
yeah,
something that hasn't really been looked into, I think,
yeah,
adequately either.
yeah. I cited so from I think it was, yeah, it would have been, it probably was in the Pope at War. I would assume that where you talked about the racial laws, was it the Pope at War or Pope and maybe it
Probably
was
the
in Pope
Pope
and
and
Mussolini.
Mussolini, with the earlier book about
Um,
the
the racial,
Pi-
yeah. And so
Pius
I
the
cite
11th.
I cited you in that section where the racial laws were implemented. And Farinacci, is that the name?
Uh-huh.
Where one of the senior fascists said, "We make this up. We're just doing what the Catholic Church did during the Papal States, and we're not making them wear yellow stars like you did." So
Right.
yeah,
Yeah, so that was, how do they justify the anti-Semitic legislation, which threw all Jewish children out of the schools, threw all Jewish teachers and professors out of work. All basically, Jews were fired from all realms of the economy and impoverished. And so, how do you justify this in a country, first of all, which has such a tiny proportion of Jews? I mean, Poland had 10% of Polish population was Jewish, 1% of Germany's, but just 1/10 of 1% of Italy's population was Jewish. Um, and so, the notion that the Jews represent some great threat to Italy was kind of hard to imagine. But so Mussolini had, if he was going to wage his anti-Semitic campaign, had to find some source of justification, and one of the main sources he found was in the Catholic Church.
yeah. That's one of my favorite quote from the Pope of Mussolini is, "A new era began. The Church a willing partner of Mussolini's fascist government." Um, I've cited that in articles in my book. I think in a couple of videos I've done. That willing partner. I use that a lot. And then you won the Pulitzer Prize for the Pope of Mussolini, correct?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, congratulations. So that's a big win. So
Yeah, you realize if you're involved in these things. I was also on the jury subsequently for the Pulitzer Prize in biography. That there's a certain amount of luck involved as well. That whoever happens, what the taste of the jurors that year and what they go for,
yeah,
is so I was fortunate, but certainly very happy to have won it.
yeah. Yeah, I think, so let me say, I have it here. I have my Kindle up. So just so chronologically, the books you didn't write them chronologically, but I will
Yeah.
read them chronologically. So we have The Pope Who Would Be King, The Exile of Pius the Ninth, and the Emergence of Modern Europe. And then we have Prisoner of the Vatican, the Popes, the Kings, and Garibaldi's Rebels in the Struggle to Rule Modern Italy, the Pope and Mussolini, and then the Pope at War. So those were the four books that really formed the core of my book, where I'm from about 1848 up to like 1946. I those four books. I just basically go chronologically. What really shocked me, I don't think a lot of people know about what happened in Italy in 1848 and 1849. That when I read The Pope Who Would Be King, that Pius the Ninth snuck out a back gate out of Rome and then smuggled down to
In
a city
disguise. Yeah.
in disguise. And then there was a secular Italian republic. Like, yeah, I'd never heard of this before. I mean, like, I would assume this is not something that's probably widely known by a lot of. Do a lot of Italians even know? like what happened in
No, I
1848.
mean, I think I'm always curious what school kids are taught in Italy because, of course, the modern Italian state people often think of as somehow ancient, but was only created in mid 19th century. Was only came about. The Kingdom of Italy came about in 1861 only as a result of a war against the papacy, a war against the Pope, and all the leaders of the founders of the Italian state were excommunicated by the Pope. So these, or Garibaldi, the great figure of swashbuckling uh, military hero of unification of Italy in the 19th century, was a ferocious anti-cleric and anti-papist. So one wonders, what are Italian school kids taught? They're really not taught this about their own history. And yeah, well, I wrote that book for the reason you kind of suggest that it seemed to me, incredibly dramatic, incredibly important, even exciting, but very little known. The fact that the Pope was driven out of Rome in the mid 19th century in 1848 and only returned as a result of the armies of Catholic powers responding to his call to reconquer Rome for him, which they did.
Yeah, yeah. It's such a fascinating era of history. Like just like the whole episode and like how the French then come in and how it's so contrary to the secular French Republic what they do and like you need to I mean, it's too complex to go into now, but it's just so weird. The French part is just so counterintuitive in what they did. Um, but it's a fascinating book. So I would highly recommend people read The Pope Who Would Be King. It is a fascinating tale of what happened in Italy, like this, the rebellion of the people. Like, you talk about like the protesters wheeled the cannon up to the gates of the Lateran Palace. Somebody standing next to the Pope was killed by a sniper. Like this, it's just an amazing tale. Like, so I would really, really recommend people read this book. I mean, it's so cool.
Well, thanks. I hope they do.
Yeah,
It's yeah, the you talk about the irony because, of course, it was the French army that reconquers Rome for the Pope and defeats Mazzini, Garibaldi, and the leaders of the Republic that had just proclaimed freedom of religion and freedom of association, um, freedom of speech, and so forth, all of which went against church doctrine and the way in which the papal states were run, freed the Jews from the ghetto, among other things. And yet the Louis Napoleon had just been elected president the previous December, and it was just following the own revolution of 1848 that took place in France, which initiated a republic. So the fact that this republic, led by a man who would become Napoleon III, but had grown up actually as something of an anti-cleric himself, and against papal rule, that this is who sent their army to restore the theocracy, is one of the real ironies of modern Italian and European history.
yeah. And you mentioned about like what kids are taught. So, like I have friends all over the world, as probably a lot of people do today. But I mean, I'm an expat. I've lived abroad for over 20 years, and I've lived in like 9 different countries. So I have friends all over the world. So I mentioned offline. I mentioned you have a friend he's got a double master's in Latin. He helps me with that. I have an Italian friend as well. So generally for Italian, I'll use Google Translate. But if Google Translate gives me a botched translation that makes no sense, I will go to my Italian friend. And her mom is a teacher, and I asked her about like freedom of religion in schools in Italy. And she said it's only been the last decade that kids now are able to opt out. Like even with Vatican II, and like the freedom of religion, that only up to like the last 8 to 10 years that there's been real freedom of religion in Italian schools. That has not, it was never really there. They were still being indoctrinated up until about a decade ago. They had no choice. But now kids are allowed to opt out of religious studies classes.
Yeah,
Maybe,
well,
okay, yeah,
that maybe longer than that. They've been theoretically able to opt out, like Jewish kids, for example. But I mean, one thing that is kind of striking to me is, there was the case in the European court, whatever it's called, not all that long ago, brought by people objecting to the fact that in all the classrooms in Italy, they have a crucifix. They're mandated to have a crucifix in every classroom, and saying that the European Charter, whatever governs the European Union, calls for separation of church and state. And the European Court, amazingly, in allowing Italy to continue to require the crucifix in every classroom in its public schools in Italy, ruled that the crucifix was not a religious symbol. Somehow it
Okay.
was a secular symbol of Italy.
Yeah. Okay.
So, strange things happen.
Yeah. I asked her name is Nicole, my Italian friend. I asked her what you mentioned in I believe it was also in Pope and Mussolini that one of the demands that Pius the 11th made of Mussolini was that September 20th no longer become a holiday, but the date of the Lateran Accords uh, the holiday instead, and that the kids today don't really understand September 20th. And I asked Nicole about that, and she's like, "No, we still kind of know. I mean, it may not be widely known, but she knows about September 20th." So, and you mentioned Garibaldi. That's on the wiki. I'm pretty sure it's on the Wikipedia page. The statue of Garibaldi that's on the Janiculum Hill. Am I saying that correctly?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
There's no citation and it's asking for proof. I mean, maybe it was said that after the Lateran Accords that when that statue was put up, Garibaldi was on his horse and he was staring at the Vatican. And then after the Lateran Accords, the statue was reversed, so he was looking away from the Vatican. Do you know if there's any truth to that?
No, actually, it was just standing there last month, was it in June? And no, he's looking back. Both he's looking back and the backside of his horse is sort of pointing toward the Vatican. So I think that's still the case. That was put up on the 25th anniversary of the taking of. So you mentioned September 20th. September 20th refers to 1870 when the Italian army broke through the walls of Rome and captured Rome and annexed it to the state of Italy, which previously it did not include Rome because it was under papal control, guarded by French troops initially. So that's the holiday of September 20th is finally Italian unity is complete with, and the following year, Rome would become Italy's capital, which it hadn't been initially because it wasn't part of Italy. Um, and so on the 25th anniversary in 1895, they dedicated that statue of the kind of hero of the unification of Italy, Garibaldi, on his horse, staring out. It's pointing out to the over the city, the historic city, but he's looking back toward the Vatican. Um, but I don't think there's anything actually around the statue that explains that symbolism.
Yeah. Yeah, I think somebody just put that in on the Wikipedia page that he was staring at the Vatican, and then after the Lateran Accords they reversed it so he was looking away. So
Yeah.
they were challenging that. So, but I thought it was an
Uh,
interesting little tidbit, whether it was true or not. So
yeah, afraid that's not, well, yeah, that isn't true, but can't believe everything you read in Wikipedia, as I learned
yeah,
when someone
yeah,
showed me what my page looked like a number of years ago, and it was kind of filled with attacks on my work from a kind of right wing Catholic point of view.
yeah, yeah. There was one of the baptism of Constantine, or it might have been Constantine's pages. What Constantine was baptized by an Arian bishop, the Eusebius of Nicomedia. But then the Acts of Sylvester come out and say, "Oh, Pope Sylvester baptized him because he had leprosy." And in the talk page, like some Catholic zealous, I'm going to prove that he was baptized by like, well, yeah, good luck, dude, because the Catholic Church doesn't even stand behind that legend anymore.
Hmm.
So, yeah. And I've seen that the same guy appeared on a couple of other pages where I was going through, like, he's on the talk page, like, oh, I'm going to prove this is true. I'm going to prove this is true. I'm like, dude, all of this stuff has been debunked. The Catholic Church doesn't even like support this anymore. Um, what was it? Was it the donation? Yeah, the donation of Rome. Like,
Constantine, yeah.
if you go to the Raphael rooms in the Vatican, and there's this painting by Raphael called the Donation of Rome, where Constantine is kneeling before Pope Sylvester and giving him the Western states. And one of the researchers, Tessa Canella, I don't know if you've come across her. She's done a lot of work into the Acts of Sylvester. And I was having a chat with her, and she says I was on a tour of the Vatican, and the tour guide was saying, "Oh yeah, this really happened, Constantine." And she's like, "Sorry, I'm a professor of history, and this is a legend. It's not true. Stop telling people that this really happened." So,
Yeah, one
yeah,
sees a certain amount of that as well.
yeah. Okay, well, I know we're a little pressed for time. It's been almost 45 minutes, so I know you need to go at the top of the hour, so we should probably wrap up. But I'd really like to thank you for coming on. It's been great talking to you. I love your books. There's more I want to get to. I just haven't had time to read them all yet because I've been trying to get my book is now done. I finished reading it, or reading it. I'm editing it now, so I'm hoping to get it out within the next year or so. But yeah,
Good
would
luck.
you be? Yeah, yeah, thank you very much. So. Great. So, can you stick around for just a couple minutes after we go off, and just, we'll wrap up together?
Okay, sure.
Great, thanks. Okay, so thanks everybody. Thank you, Professor Kertzer, for coming on and talking about your research and your career and you've been doing. It's been a great talk for me. I hope other people enjoyed it as well. I will put a link to David's page where you can find all of his books. Please read his books. If you read read The Pope Who Would Be King. It is such a phenomenally good story. So, but read them all. But definitely read that one. So great. So thank you, Professor Kertzer. I really appreciate the time, and we will sign off, and we will see everybody on the next episode. Take care, and bye-bye. Thanks for watching. Please check out the other videos on my channel if history is your thing, and see you next time.